In the previous lesson, we created a static class called data that we can use in our application to interact with our data store. But of course, our data class needs a file data provider in order to actually work. Now, the technical term for this static class would be an abstraction layer. We have abstracted away all of the details for interacting with our data store so that our application really doesn't care how that's done. And that then allows us to be able to swap out data providers whenever we need to. Abstraction layers are a very powerful thing that you can add to your applications. The most common use for them is to be able to use different data stores or different types of databases. Like there's a lot of software out there that supports both MySQL databases and Microsoft SQL databases, and they would use a data abstraction layer so that the customers using that software can use whatever data store that they want. Now, that's all well and good. However, we do have an issue here in that we can technically pass anything to this initialize method. Here I've passed a string, and if we try to look at this in the browser, of course, it's going to blow up because a string does not have the methods that our data provider has. We need to be able to get terms or search terms or add, update, or delete a term. So we need some way to ensure that whatever we pass to this initialize method has the necessary methods to work with our data. Now, we can mentally keep track of that, and that's perfectly fine. However, we can also write a little bit of extra code and let PHP worry about what we pass to initialize. And I much prefer that approach because the less I have to worry about, well, the happier I am. So there's different ways that we can accomplish this. And in this course, we are going to use inheritance. But before we get into that, let's just look at inheritance. So let's create a new file. This is going to go in the root of 5.4, and I'm going to call it pen.class.php. This isn't going to be part of our application, but we need a code file for some examples. So I've used, just a pen as an example when talking about objects. So let's write a class that we would use to programmatically represent a pen. So we would have a property called ink color, and then we could have a public method called write, because every pen is going to have a color. It's going to be able to write a message, and we're just going to echo out that message. And that's great. However, we need to be a little bit more technical here, because we don't really think about different types of pens. We just pick up a pen and we just start writing. However, if we're going to be making pens, we need to be very specific. We need to be very detail oriented. So the pen that I have in my hand right now has a cap, and not every pen has a cap. Some are retractable. So if we are actually going to write with these pens that we are creating, we need methods to be able to take a cap off and to retract the point. Now, it doesn't make sense to add methods in this pen class because not every pen has a cap and not every pen has a retractable system. So instead, it would make much more sense to create classes to represent those other types of pens. So we can do that. Let's go ahead and let's write a class called capped pen, or we could just say pen with cap. And then we could have our public ink color, and we could have our public write. And as you can see, I am essentially duplicating all of the code that we wrote for the pen class. Well, we don't want to do that because in object-oriented programming, we have this concept of inheritance. Now, inheritance in programming is a lot like genetic inheritance in that we, human beings, are inheriting the properties, the traits, even behaviors of whoever made us, our parents. And that's the same thing that happens in our applications. So what we have here is two classes. We have a class for pen, then we have a pen with cap. What we want to do is inherit the ink color, because every pen has an ink color. We don't want to have to duplicate that over and over again. And every pen can write. Once again, we don't want to duplicate that for every class. So instead, we extend the pen class. And then automatically, we inherit all of the traits and behaviors from pen. So that by default, automatically, our pen with cap gets the ink color property. It also gets the write method. So if we wanted to create a capped pen, we could easily do that by calling the constructor. And then we can toggle the cap, because we need to do that before we write. And we will write something. I mean, it really doesn't matter what, but we'll just write some text. And then, of course, we would want to put the cap back on. So we would toggle the cap. Well, let's look at the same thing for a retractable pen. So we can essentially take what we've already written for our pen with cap. We can copy and paste, except that this is going to be retractable pen. It extends the pen, and the method that it's going to have is called toggle point. So now we can create an object that represents a retractable pen. I'm going to call it rect pen. And we would essentially do the same thing, but instead of this case, we would toggle the point, we would then write, and then we would toggle the point again to retract it. But let's make this a little bit more complete, because we do need to set the ink color here. So we can have our constructor, and that's where we would put the ink color. So we would pass that there, and we would set that inside of the constructor. And so by doing that, we don't have to declare that there in the class. So now we can say that the pen with the cap, that's going to have black ink. The retractable pen is going to have blue ink. And even though we don't have a constructor and we didn't define the ink color inside of pen with cap or retractable pen, those things are going to be there automatically. Now, not only can we inherit the traits and behaviors, but we can also override anything that was defined. So if we wanted to, inside of the retractable pen, we could write our own write. If we had some customizations that we needed to do, we could do it with here. And I'm not sure what we would want to do, but we could just say that written with retractable pen, and then we would include the message. So now our pen with cap would just write the message that we passed to it. The retractable pen would use the write method that overrides the original one, because we define that inside of our retractable pen. So with that in mind, we can go to our data folder, and let's create a new file. We'll call it data provider.class.php. And this is going to be a base class for all of our data providers. And to save us some time, let's go to our file data provider, and let's copy that code and then paste it inside of data provider. And really the only thing that we need to be concerned with are the methods, but we don't want any default behavior here, because when it comes to working with our data, that is specific to each individual data provider. So these methods aren't going to do anything. They're just going to be there so that we can overwrite them later. Now, these private methods for getting the data and setting the data, those are specific for our JSON implementation. So we're going to delete those. We don't need those here. And one other thing I'm going to do is change our property name, because this is a generic data provider. It's not really working with a path. It's not really working with anything. So I'm just going to call this source. So for our file data provider, it's going to be the path to the file. For our database, whenever we get there, it's going to have the information for connecting to our database. And with that done, we can go to our data class, And let's go ahead and require that data provider, because what we're going to do is use a type hint for our initialize method so that only a class that inherits from data provider can be passed to it. This means that in file data provider, we can get rid of this require because that's being done elsewhere. We do need to change some things here. Now, first of all, we can get rid of the constructor because that is being inherited from the data provider. We do need to extend data provider, and we need to change our file path that is now source. But other than that, everything else should work fine. And of course, we will definitely find out if it doesn't. And now we need to go to app because we do need to include, well, no, we don't. We are automatically including that data provider, aren't we? So everything should still work as is. Let's refresh, and there we go. Everything is working just fine. Now, if we try to pass anything else to initialize, we of course are going to see that it's not going to work. But now we're going to have a different error message than before. Uncaught type error. Argument 1 passed to data initialize must be an instance of data provider. So now we have something that's very clear. If we pass something that is not a data provider to this initialize method, then we see an error message explicitly saying that. And that's much easier to fix than trying to track down why a particular object didn't work for our data provider. So there we go. By using inheritance, we have made our application a little more robust so that in the next lesson, we can get started working with a database.